Horoscopes, house systems, and the solar chart. I've created this visual presentation because everybody reads their horoscope, or at least a lot of people do, the world over, and they actually work. But according to some, they shouldn't. According to astronomers, they shouldn't. According to some astrologers, they shouldn't. But they do. And I've been writing a horoscope for many years, 25 years in fact, and I've come to understand how and why they work. And I thought I'd just share this presentation to illustrate some of that and give you an idea of why, when you read your horoscope, it actually works. And this will provide a good foundation for other videos which I'm going to be creating to help you understand astrology better. Now, the first thing you want to understand is that when you look at an astrological mandala, which is where you have 12, a circle divided into 12, and you have 12 signs, and houses are best understood as reflections of the signs, so the first house and the first sign. Aries is the first sign of the zodiac, and I'll show you in a moment what the natural zodiac looks like, where Aries sits on the first house cusp. So the basic point here is that the signs and the houses have a parallel principle to them. So the first house is reflective of the first sign, Aries. The second house is reflective of the second sign, Taurus. And the third house reflective of the third sign, Gemini, and so on throughout the zodiac. All right. Now, just a quick mention of the Earth turning on its axis and the direction it's going in, and why we see the houses and the signs moving in the direction they do. We see them starting on the left and turning counterclockwise because the Earth turns counterclockwise, basically. Now, also, the chart hosts the left side as east and the right side as west, and that normally isn't the case. But because we're looking at a star map, which means we're looking up in the heavens at the planets, etc., and then when we bring that map onto the table, everything reverses. That's the basic gist of the reason why it appears reversed. Okay, it's like a sort of inside out, if you like, or reversed is the simplest way of putting it. Now, what you want to understand is that there's, in astrology, more than one house system. And this is where it gets quite technical with houses. Many astrologers generally choose a house system and work with it because it proves to work for them. And but there are, on one hand, if we see on the left table here, the 0 Aries chart, which I'll explain in a moment and illustrate, the solar chart, the equal chart, the whole signs chart, and Sun on the first house, or any planet for that matter, are all in a similar category because they all basically produce what's called the equal house system, where the 360-degree circle is divided by 12, and each house, therefore, is an equal 30 degrees. Whatever degree. So in the case of the sun, say you were born with your sun at 10 Cancer, well, every house cusp would have 10 on that house cusp. So, and I'll illustrate that again later, but basically speaking, the houses will be divided equally, but that's not the case with this list of house systems. This is where the sky gets divided in different ways according to different philosophies and ways of looking at the night sky, or the sky in general. When from the earth plane we're looking up, we want to divide the sky, etc. And really we're dividing more than just the sky above. We're really dividing the circle, the globe itself, you could say, or the perspective of the spherical globe out into space, in effect. So that's the simplest way of describing it, but it is important to note that when you begin to study house systems and the way that the sky is divided, etc., it can be quite technical, and you get into what's called celestial geometry, and we don't have time for that today. And again, which house system one would use in a more general everyday sense is up for debate. Most astrologers using Western astrology use Placidus, and there's good reason for it. Placidus can be described as the house division or the house system of the sun, and Western astrology is very solar, and that's true also of horoscopes. So horoscopes are very specifically an expression of Western astrology, which is a solar system of astrology, where most other systems of astrology are lunar. All right. Now, the incorporation of solar and lunar is a feature. I mean, we're not dismissing the moon by any means, but you just want to understand that Western astrology is based on the sun's light. Now, so let's return then. That's a bit of background on houses and the fact that they correspond to the signs. 12 signs, 12 houses. And when we work with an equal house system, each are the same degree. In fact, in an equal house system or an Aries chart, as we saw above, the houses and the signs parallel one another. But when you actually enter into practice of doing charts, you recognize that there's a separation between the signs and the houses. It's a bit technical to explain, but basically the house wheel remains where it is while the sign wheel turns. And I'll show you that in a moment. You'll get an idea. It takes a few visits to this basic principle to understand it, but you get the idea that the sign wheel of 12 times 30-degree signs and the house wheel 12 times 30-degree signs in the whole house system, or equal, or sun on the first, or Aries, the left-hand column I showed you, versus the other, where you understand that the wheel of the houses stays and the wheel of the signs turns. And the reason the signs turn is because the earth turns. Okay, so you get a basic notion, of course, with astrology that you're dealing with the theme of we're on the planet and it's turning on its axis as it also orbits the sun, but it's that turning on its axis that specifically produces the ever-changing sign that appears on the ascendant. That's why we all have different rising signs, and they may, of course, differ than our sun sign. So people will generally ask, well, what's your sun sign? And then they'll often, if they know a bit more about astrology, they'll ask, and what's your rising sign? So the sun sign and the rising sign actually, though, do share a core correspondence. They're both related to the first house and Aries as a principle. Even if your sun sign's, let's say, Sagittarius, when you're rising, whatever your rising sign is, you might say your rising sign's Taurus, so your rising sign is linked to the first house. It's again a bit technical, but we'll explain as we go along. Now, what you basically want to understand with a horoscope, once again, is that it's based on the sun's light. And so the sun holds a very special place in astrology. Of course, it's the star of the show, literally and figuratively. And the sun should be understood as more than an object in the sky. Simply referring to the sun as an object in the sky is quite missing the point to the deeper implications of what is going on. And of course, we experience the solar system from the Earth's perspective. That's why astrology is geocentric. But generally speaking, most astrologers, if not all, but there are a few who will argue this point in this rising movement of flat Earth debate that's going on. But basically, generally speaking, we understand that the Earth, from where we experience the solar system, we experience our experiential reality is that the sun and planets orbit around us, but we know that the sun is at the center of the solar system. Okay, so that's an important understanding that it's a perceptual thing. Here we experience the sun rising and setting and the planets orbiting us, but we know that the sun's at the center of the solar system. But the main point also is that the sun is more than just an object. It's in a mystical spiritual tradition, it's best understood as the logos. It has an intelligence. It's a being, if you like, a cosmic being. It's been described as a solar lord. If one were to understand deeper the principle of logos, you'd begin to understand what we're talking about. But what's important here is that the principle of logos, which is the deeper mystical logic of the universe, which invariably is holistic. That's where it starts to, we're entering into a point of departure, which is really important now for understanding the solar system. You have to understand the holistic principle of existence in order to really understand what you're looking at. So the sun holds a very important spiritual, mystical placement. And as we unravel the principle of holism, you'll get a deeper sense of the principle behind the sun, the logos. I like to refer to it as sort of a handshake or an agreement that existence has with itself in terms of the wholeness of existence, and existence being multidimensional. We are multidimensional beings living in a multidimensional universe. This is one example of the as above, so below principle. It's also in the Bible, we are made in the image of God, if you like. We're made in the image of nature. And the best way to, basically to understand that is the multidimensional principle. It is multidimensional, the universe, the manifest universe, and we are multidimensional. And this is the beginning of an understanding of the intrinsic mysticism or metaphysics of it. That's why astronomers often don't understand astrology, because they think in terms of physics. Physics is leverage, push, pull, forces acting upon one another, whereas holism and metaphysics is more a principle of oneness, where the whole contains within it parts, but the whole remains greater than the sum of the parts. The main point here is that when we're in duality, we're in the manifest universe as souls, incarnate, embodied, in duality. That's the understanding. When you begin to enter into discussion of duality, you're understanding that duality means there's an up and down, here and there, you and I, him and her. And it goes on with these polarity principles. The two ends of the same pole are very intimately united, but they are relatively separate. And this is where we get into the whole understanding of yin and yang, and again, up and down, and here and there. They're polarity principles within duality. So that's some of the language that you begin to entertain as you discuss about how it works, how the wholeness of things means that all dimensions, all aspects of the universe, all things within creation, all dimensions ultimately are one thing. That's the principle of oneness. That's the spiritual notion. It's all things appear separate, but yet they are ultimately one. Now, it's important to understand here that at higher dimensions, there is no sense of duality. There is no here and there. There is no yin and yang. There is no up and down or him and her. Those higher dimensions would be understood as without separation. There's no duality there. So those are what would be called the deeper or higher dimensions. The throne, some would call the source. It does not have a dualistic principle. But it is important to understand that it's not only the physical manifest universe that is dualistic. Let's say we were discussing the astral realm, and you're in let's say, out of your physical body, but you're, on the other side, shall we say. You're in the astral realm, and you can see things. If you can see any object or other being or anything, if there's a sense of you and something else, you're still in duality, even though you're not in the physical manifest. So that's rather an important principle. It's a deeper reach of what I generally intended to touch upon, but it stretches your consciousness to understand that in duality is like an agreement between the personality and the soul. The soul itself is said to be non-dualistic in its essence, in its pure spiritual essence. It's non-dualistic. And that's, again, a bit hard to understand. But when we're in the manifest, realm, in the body, in creation, etc., we're in duality. So we have this agreement, shall we say. It's one way of describing it. It's not maybe the final one, but we understand that there's this paradoxical game is a way of describing it, okay? There's a paradox that in duality, this is where the notion of East Indian mystics, for example, would say, oh, this is all an illusion. This isn't ultimately real. And Western science tells us that as well. It's not ultimately, finally real. And this is where we get the notion of paradox, okay? Best way I can describe it at this time. Now, the Mandelbrot set, this is a fractal principle. The best way to begin to understand holism is you understand fractals. And this is where we start to get closer to the understanding of horoscopes. Okay, so a fractal is where the whole is contained within the part. Okay, so what you're seeing here in this basic image is, well, it's quite a complex image, really. These computer-generated principle, like the Mandelbrot set was created by virtue of an iteration process through computers. Mathematical equations iterated, meaning they repeat. But that is not where they originate from. It's only a model that's explaining what's actually occurring in nature. That's really important to understand. And I'll save that for another video, but we're going to get a little piece of this right now, is that you're getting a taste of that the whole is contained within the part. Similarly, like DNA or the cell in your body. Every cell in the body is a replicant of every other cell. That's a really hard thing to understand for some people. And it's a really complex and it's a miraculous thing. It's a paradox of its own sort. So, okay, so every cell contains within it the DNA that every other cell does as well. That's an interesting basic takeaway. So as you go into the part, as you see in this image, it continually contains the whole. So it's wonderful, paradoxical, mystical, and that's the beginning of understanding of how the horoscopes work, because each sign is a shift of the perspective of the same background perspective of planets for that time span, whether it's a day, a week, a month, a year. You get that basic time frame behind it, and you begin to understand that there's a reason why we can look at the planetary alignments from the perspective of each sign, each whole sign, from the standpoint of Aries or Taurus, Gemini, and I'll again show you that in a moment. So there we go. A principle of fractals is the theme, the core way of explaining or illustrating holism. All right. So it's really hard, really, in duality to really illustrate holism. That was one way. This is another way. And I can continue to show you images. It becomes psychedelic almost. It becomes, well, actually, it becomes psychedelic. It becomes cosmic. It becomes mystical. You cannot just think with a linear mind. You have to get past linear, logical, computational deductions about things, which kind of are basically a pure linear perspective is parts. Everything's separate from everything else, which on one hand, that's how we experience life. You know, everything has its respective place and existence and separation. But in a higher minded perspective, or even if you want to say in a quantum field, they begin to merge and morph, and we just see them as more waves of energy merging into one another, etc. And so we get the cosmic ocean principle. So it's not easy to depict. Now, what I want to explain really briefly here is there's a difference between holism and holistic, but of course they're basically one and the same. But holistic takes the principle of holism and gives it a nice division of mental, emotional, physical, spiritual. This is where we're entering back into the astrology perspective, because physical would be earth, spiritual would be fire, emotional, water, intellectual, air, as simple as that. So the earth, air, fire, and water principle married into the notions of physical, spiritual, emotional, intellectual, begin to come fairly clear. We can also talk about north, south, east, and west in the same way, or the four corners on the square if you like. Or you can put the cross in the circle and you get the same principle. And that's where you also get what would be the rising point of the sun on the, let's say, the east, the Aries point. On the west would be the setting point of the sun. On the top would be the south, would be the zenith of the sun at noon. And on the bottom north would be the sun, well, at midnight, basically, where you don't see it, where it's dark. Okay, so that's another example of the 4 points. So we have the 4 elements, we have the 4 directions, we have the sun rising, the sun at high noon, the sun setting, and the sun at midnight, and you get this basic understanding of those 4 corners of the day. Then we get this understanding of physical, spiritual, emotional, intellectual. So this is the example of holistic, which is the expression of holism. We recognize that each of these apparently separate principles share an intrinsic relationship. They're all reflections of one another. Now, we're back to the actual zodiac. So that's background's rather important. When you get a background, like I just explained to you, you begin to understand, okay, your mind starts to wrap itself around what you're thinking about. There's a holistic principle, and which can also be described as paradoxical, mystical, spiritual, and it's all true. This oneness, the mysticism of no division, no separation, the paradox that we experience that. So this is where it gets a little tricky in the language, and you have to kind of bounce back and forth between your linear mind that wants to label and identify things as separate versus your more left brain approach, where your right brain wants to more see it as merged and synthesized, is the basic way of saying it. Now, the natural zodiac, what you're looking at is what would be an astrological mandala. The mandala shows, if you look at it basically, here you have Aries. Aries, that's the glyph or the symbol for Aries. That's Taurus. This is Gemini, Cancer, Leo, Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, Pisces. Now, Aries rules or is linked to the first house, Taurus to the second, Gemini to the third, Cancer to the fourth, Leo to the 5th, Virgo to the 6th, 7, Libra, 8, Scorpio, 9, Sagittarius, 10, Capricorn, 11, Aquarius, 12, Pisces. All right. So you also get the circle divided by 12. So each of these would be 30-degree segments, fairly obvious. 360 by 12 equals 30. So you get this understanding that the natural zodiac always positions Aries here. Aries is the sign that symbolizes the rising sun. Okay, this would be the 6 a.m. point. This would be the 6 p.m., the setting sun point. This would be the 12 noon point. And this would be the 12 midnight point. All right. So you begin to understand, wow, that's cool. We get that's called the cardinal cross. Once again, that'd be this in this case, because of the chart on the table versus in the sky, east, west, south, north. Okay, kind of goes in a reverse order as mentioned. So the natural zodiac is the base template. Okay, it's like when you're about to type, you have your fingers on the specific keys across that, say that's your home base. So that's how the best basic way to describe the natural zodiac is that it's home base. And so Aries and the solar chart are linked to this. So the natural zodiac always shows the house and the sign in alignment and equal houses and signs of 30 degrees each. So now if we look at the Taurus chart, just quickly, I want to show you now, that's the Aries chart. There's Aries on the ascendant. So if we want to see the Taurus chart, what you're going to see now is Taurus on the ascendant. Aries has shifted one sign. So we're turning the dial. So where Taurus would normally be ruling the second house, it's now been moved to the first house. Gemini has naturally occupied the second house, Cancer the third. So every sign now is occupying the house beside it by one. Now, if we move to the Gemini chart, now Gemini is on the ascendant. Okay. So Gemini is on the ascendant, and Cancer now is on the second house cusp. Leo's on the third. So we could say when Gemini is on the ascendant, Leo is on the house cusp of Gemini. Okay. Cancer's on the house cusp of Taurus. It goes like that. We'll just do one more example. We're looking now at the Cancer chart. Okay. So there's Cancer now on the position of the ascendant. Leo is on the house cusp of Taurus, the second house cusp. Virgo on the third house cusp. Libra on the fourth house cusp. Now, there's an intrinsic story behind that, by the way. If you want to really understand a sign well, you place it on the ascendant point, the first house cusp, and you begin to look at where the signs are in relationship to that. So in the natural zodiac, okay, in a solar chart for Cancer, the sign of Libra occupies the fourth house cusp, which in the natural, the Aries chart, is where Cancer lives. So the language is like that. You begin to get used to just simply a transference. I'm going to show it to you in one more fashion here, one more illustration. So say you're reading your horoscope, you're an Aries. Okay, so you see the Aries principle, you know what your sign is in Western astrology. So what we do is we look here recently, now this would be the Aries chart. Once again, it's a whole house system or equal house chart. Okay. And what we had recently on the 15th of January 2018, we had a new moon. It was a solar eclipse. There was the new moon in Aquarius. So there's the planets in the sky. Okay. From the standpoint of Aries, that's the key takeaway. You're looking at the planetary alignment from the standpoint of that zodiac sign, that archetype. Okay. Now, Taurus. You want to read your sun sign, you can read that you're reading the horoscope for Taurus now. So same principle, but we take Taurus and place it on the ascendant, and then all the planets which are in the exact same alignment as they were with the Aries chart, they've just shifted one whole sign to the left or going counterclockwise. Let's see that again with Gemini. So if you're reading your horoscope or somebody's horoscope, family member, etc. for Gemini, you would do the same thing. But here now you see Gemini's on the ascendant, all the planets in the exact same aspects you see here. We'll explain that another time. Everything's shifted. Now just pay attention now. You see the sun's here, the moon. You saw that it was here when it was Aries. They were all here. For Taurus, they were all here. I'm talking about this stellium of planets in Aquarius. Now for Gemini, they're in the ninth house. Okay, so watch now. I'm going to show you Cancer, and then the sun, moon, the new moon in Aquarius that occurred on that solar eclipse on the 15th of February will actually be occurring in the 8th house. Okay, the houses aren't being shown here, but you remember 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, just like that, right? Okay, so let's take another look from the standpoint of Cancer. And so there's the sign of Cancer, and we look at the zodiac, and there's the sign of Cancer on the ascendant, the Aries point, and there's the sun, moon, Mercury, etc., the new moon that occurred in the 8th house in the same planetary alignments. So then we read it according to the aspects are the same, the sign that the planets are in is the same, but the house is different, and that difference of the house is significant. And I'm going to just basically tell you that for now. You begin now to understand, now I understand what they mean by the house. And you can look at it as it's generally understood as the setting of where it occurs. So then basically you can see that the house determines where the activity is occurring. Where is the sun and moon, for example, and all the planets, where? And the house contains within it a core theme, and that's where you understand the sign itself. So this would be the house of Scorpio. So when the sun moon happens in the 8th house, they carry a scorpionic theme to them. Even though the new moon occurred in Aquarius, because it's occupying the 8th house, it has a Scorpio flavor to it. And all the themes of Scorpio blend. It's a blending of the sign principle and the house principle. Simple as that, but it's an art to interpret that blend in such a way as it makes sense to the person. It applies to their life. They can use that information, practically speaking, in fact, and that's really another level of mystery. Why does this translate into my life? And that's where we get back to the principle of holism. It's an understanding that you live in the universe, shall we say, and the universe is in you. Now, when we say you're in the universe, it's because you're in a body, on a planet, in a solar system, in a galaxy, which is in the universe. That's how it basically goes, okay? So when you're in the body, you're in the manifest universe, because you're in the body, on the earth, in the solar system, in the galaxy. Okay, that's why. But on the other hand, the mysticism is that the universe is within you, and this is a paradox. So now when we say the universe is within you, once again, when we get into the holism principle, we recognize that the east, west, north, south represents a core fractal principle. So the key is fractals. And again, it's not the easiest thing to understand this for all people, that you're in the universe and the universe is in you. But we know that's true of elements. All the elements that go to make the planets and stars are within us. The very same elements are contained within our very body. That's where we once again describe the as above, so below, made in the image of God or nature, if you like. And we also get what I call a principle of sympathetic resonance. Like there's a deep sympathy, that's the word, but also that it's an intrinsic oneness, and that's where it gets mystical. So astrology is difficult for people to understand often because they can't breach beyond the linear mind perspective. You have to really think right and left brain simultaneously. Really, that's what it requires. And one of the wonderful things about astrology is if you study it, it begins to exercise your right and left brain synthesis. So the very study of astrology is beneficial for you. And that's true of other subjects as well. It's not just astrology, but it's when you weave your logical mind and your intuitive mind, basically, or your sensory with your more imaginative, etc. So there's just a weave of different hemispheres of the brain, basically. So we get the mysticism of holism there. And one of the important things, once again, is you're in the universe and the universe is in you. And this begins to become a feature of your projection. So what you're seeing here is not just that this is not just meant to illustrate vision or sight. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about projection. Projection is very important understanding. It means that we are like mini projectors. Now, the archetypes are the building block of existence, and astrology works with archetypal principles. So there's another discussion, I'll just say it for now, that the principle of archetypes, which are the blueprint of existence, that goes into the very making of the microcosm and the macrocosm, the fact that the atomic structure has a similar structure as to the cosmic. The nucleus has protons and neutrons orbiting it, just as the sun has planets and orbiting it, for example. Those are basic examples of the microcosm, macrocosm, the as within, so without. All right, that's the as above, so below, the as within, so without principle. So we as projectors is the key. Now, if you look at your birth chart, your natal chart, you actually project that theme. The moment you were born, the day, the place, etc., is like a archetypal lens that you will invariably project, and by that projection you will attract those experiences to you. Okay, that's your natal chart. which is a bit of a departure from the main focus. So getting back to the fact that, and it's a bit of a leap here, is where people can get that, but sometimes they don't understand, well, how come my sun sign's Aries according to Western astrology. There's all these other people out there in the world who are born under Aries, and how is it that they will have the same horoscope? That doesn't make any sense to me. And it's basically because the archetype of Aries, which goes back to the sun, your sun is in that sign, takes the logos, which is a logic of a non-linear, holistic sort. And it means that you're a part of the Aries club. It's like being Canadian versus American, for example. See, if you're Canadian, it's distinctly different than if you're American, even though they're close. People, when we travel around the world, it's not always clear, are you Canadian or you're American, for example. It's not obvious from the outside, but we resonate to the nation where we belong to. We kind of have this vibrational resonance principle. So if something happens in your country, you feel it a little bit more intimately than if it was in somebody else's country. Even if sometimes let's say you live on the border of the United States, and so the Americans, just right across the border, there's people living there, they're Americans. But but even say you lived way up north, for example, the notion of what goes on in the States will be the same. In other words, you can live close to the border or far away, but you're still contained within Canada. So Canada in this respect would be like a sign, and the United States would be like a sign. It's not the perfect description. Some people are very linear logical. They have a hard time. It's not there's more to say about this, but you basically get that if your sun sign's Aries, it's like being Canadian. And versus American, you're sort of like Cancer, for example, and you begin to understand that what happens within that domain affects me more intimately than it would the other. Does it mean it's exactly the same? No. Does it mean that ultimately it's a personal experience? Yes. But is there a generic theme behind it? Yes. There is a generic core essential principle that you're Canadian and you resonate to that reality in that zone of the world, even if you're at a different location of the world. And the same is true if you're American or any other nationality for that matter, of course. But just to make a point of the signs, they're like you're part of that larger archetype. And so you invariably are impacted by it. But how ultimately it comes down on what I call ground zero, your life, will be something that the horoscope requires that you adapt to your life. So some people who write horoscopes do better than others because they know how to write in such a way that the principle that's being shared has a more integrative opportunity. You can take the information and not feel like it's limited. So you can embody that message and see how it applies. That's the key word. How does that apply to me? How can I see that as reflective of my life? Or the word would be synchronistic, which is a key word linked to holism, by the way, the principle of synchronicity, which I'll explain in another video. So it takes a while to understand these things. I'm trusting that some of you get it, some of you don't as quickly, as is true of many things. We just don't all think the same way. So the main takeaway here is holism and fractals. All right. And the principle of the sun as logos is extremely powerful. So when you understand these and you start to appreciate that, wow, just because I'm a sun sign Aries or Taurus or Gemini, I'm linked to that archetypal principle. Is that what you're saying? Yes, that's it. And it's a fractal of the holistic, because the circle divided into 12, by the way, the 12 signs, which are a reflection of the 12 houses and vice versa, represent a tidy division of the circle by 12 into 30-degree segments. Very nice, very even, very tidy. This is where, and then you understand that each sign has an archetypal principle, because, it just take a circle and divide it. And even if if you color each segment of the 12, you go, that color is different than the other color. Each color, each segment is unique, and you belong to that archetypally. That's the best, simplest way I could explain it at this time, and trust that you get, wow, this is more than I thought, as a celebration of the horoscope and how it works, has this intricate, amazing, holistic holism principle, this archetypal, fractal based. Wow, can I explain this easily to somebody? Probably not, because it's a language, an understanding, a perception of reality that you have to sit with for a while. But some of you will. Some of you will naturally think this way, and some of you, by your education, do think this way. So you understand the holistic archetypal principle, which invariably is paradoxical once again into manifest existence, and you start to work with these core archetypal principles to which you resonate. And that's the basis of the solar logos, the logic, the inner mysticism of the sun. That's how powerful the sun is. That's so important to understand. The sun has that kind of power, and it's not just a linear, it's not just physics, it's not just energy, it's not just warmth and rays. It's more than that. The sun is not merely an object. It's not merely emitting energy fields. It's more. And that's what metaphysics is about. It sounds religious practically. It sounds spiritual certainly. It's definitely mystical. And it becomes paradoxical. And that's what metaphysics and holism are. And they manifest, by the way, a final takeaway here with the zodiac signs is that when you see the planetary alignments on a week-to-week basis, for example, the themes that they represent provide or produce what you can call a synchronistic expression, and that's where I was showing you this image. The synchronicity is because you're not just simply a part, you're an expression of existence. The universe is within you, you're within it. And when you begin to understand that deep, intimate relationship, now you're into the spiritual science. Now you understand the mysticism. Imagine that behind this simple little weekly horoscope, which is put aside and dismissed and casually, considered, it has this deeper theme of metaphysics and holism and spirituality behind it. Yes, it is true. That's the beauty of astrology. And so I hope you enjoyed that. It gives you a bit of a closer understanding, a deeper understanding. And so next time you read your horoscope, you'll understand a little bit more, and you go, wow, this is like a micro focus of a very profound cosmic, metaphysical, holistic principle. Yes, indeed it is. Thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoyed that.